Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Mr. Richardson. We are ready to begin with our next witness, which is Mr. Richardson.
Yes, good morning, Justice.
Remember, we have to swear the witness.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask first.
Good morning, Mr. Richardson. If you would please confirm the Bible.
I'll
Okay.
confirm, yeah.
All right. So if you could repeat after me, please.
Definitely.
I, Danny Richardson,
I, Danny Richards,
do solemnly and sincerely affirm,
do
solemnly and
solemnly
sincerely affirm
affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall go,
shall be the truth
the whole truth
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
So help me God.
When you speak.
I don't want to break the rules.
No, it's okay.
Mr. Swan?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Richardson. Mr. Richardson, could you let us know your full name, please?
I can't hear you.
Sorry, Mr. Richardson, could you let us know your full name, please?
My full name,
Yes, please, sir.
Mervyn Denny Richardson.
Okay. And Mr. Richardson, you currently reside at 11 Railway Terrace in Pembroke?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Richardson, you provided a witness statement that was given to Mr. Carlton Adams. That's
Yeah.
about 6 pages long. Is that
That is
correct?
correct.
Yes,
That
sir.
is correct.
Yes. And you have a copy in front of you. Is that correct?
I have a copy in front of me.
Okay. So, Justice, I'll be able to add as Exhibit MDR1, which is Mr. Richardson's statement, as exhibit to the record.
It is so entered.
I proceed again.
Yes, I'm gonna go ahead and ask you some specific questions in regards to things that are in your witness statement, and have that listed for the commissioners. Okay.
Okay.
So, Mr. Richardson, you are a descendant of the Smiths and Talbot family, which reside in
that
Toxtown?
is correct.
Yes, sir. And it's correct that B.D. Talbot is your great-great-grandmother's brother?
That is correct.
Okay. And your great-great-great-great aunts were sisters, yes. And your father's great-great-great aunts were sisters Linda Smith and Julia Talbot, is that correct?
That is incorrect.
Sorry.
In a material particular, there are too many greats.
Okay. How many greats would they be then? My apologies.
They were my father's great aunts, not great aunts.
Oh, okay. Thank you for clarifying that for me. And B.D. Talbot's full name would have been Benjamin Darrell Talbot, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And also, we are correct in our understanding that Mr. Talbot's remains were buried at the Hurley Trinity Church in Baylor's Bay?
That is correct.
Okay. And you also indicated that Lydia Smith, your aunt, your great aunt, and Julia Talbot owned land in Tuckerstown?
That is correct.
Okay. And they owned 35 acres?
apiece.
apiece. So in
Correct.
total 70 acres, yes? In total
That is
70
correct.
acres, yes? Okay.
Yes.
And B.D. Tolbert himself also owned 70 acres.
That is correct.
Okay. And in terms of the act's appropriation, B.D. Tolbert had in fact indicated to the government that he wanted 25,000 pounds for his 70-acre land. Is that correct?
That's all he requested.
That's all he requested. And in actual fact, the tribunal only awarded him 8,000 pounds. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Okay. And in terms of Julia Smith and Julia Tolbert and Lydia Smith, they received a nominal sum for their property, which was less than half of what B.D. Tolbert got. So
That is-
approximately they got just under 4,000 pounds.
That is correct.
And as a result of that award, they then, Julia and Lydia then brought property along Napton Hill in Smith's Parish. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And there are still family descendants of them that are still residing at that same
They
property?
are still residents of that property.
Still residents of that property. And we understand that B.D. Tolbert was, in fact, a businessman.
It's what?
That B.D. Tolbert was a businessman who ran a general supply store,
That's absolutely correct.
and that store was located in Turkestan as well.
Just in Turkestan at the entrance by the intersection of South Road and Turkestan Road.
Okay. B.D. Tolbert also had a horse-drawn carriage that he would.
He had a series of horse-drawn vehicles.
Okay.
He had a team of 14 horses. And the draft was of a pair of horses per vehicle.
Okay. And this store would have supplied the Turkestan community at that time.
That is correct.
Okay. And also the people of Hamilton Parish as much as he could.
There's nobody.
Okay. And Lydia Smith and Julia Tolbert farmed their land. So their 70 total acres, they were using as farmland.
That is correct. They were farmers.
They were farmers, okay. So you also let us know that Lydia Smith, Turkestan in general would have been a place that was very private and very a tight-knit community. Would that be correct?
They were on their way.
Yes. And that there would have been moments or times in history where runaway slaves would have hid in Turkestan. Is that correct?
Ask the question again.
Okay. So you indicated that people in Turkestan would have not been nosy and there was ability to conceal runaway slaves. So would it be correct that runaway slaves would have come and hid in Turkestan?
There was a play written concerning the runaway slaves, and Turkestan was considered the area, and in the play it was called Pauperstan instead of Turkestan. So if that account is correct, then they did house runaway slaves.
So, as far as that then goes, and going along that theme, persons who had lots of land in Turkestan would have had space and ability to then conceal the runaway slaves within their property.
That is correct, and provide work and shelter for them.
All right. And in terms of B.D. Talbot, when he lost his property due to expropriation, he then acquired property in Devil's Hill,
That is correct.
and he also built a home there and erected a new store.
Yes,
Okay. And he lived upstairs of that grocery store.
that's right.
Right. And the building stands today. So where exactly is that building located for us?
Are you asking me the location for that property?
Yes, I am.
It's near the junction of Devil's Hole Hill and Harrington Sound Road, to the west of that intersection.
Okay. And after the expropriation, in terms of Lydia and Julia, they became too old at that point to continue to farm land. So the property that they got in Harrington's on Napton Hill was not used for farming at that particular point. Is that fair to assume?
They farmed that land very briefly, and because of their ages, they decided to dispose of it by sharing it with their grandchildren,
Okay.
nieces, and nephews, and that's where we live today.
Okay. Because your father would have been one of those
One of those nephews said,
acquired so many
that
properties.
is correct.
Okay. And you went on to then indicate that your mom also lived and worked in Turkestan
Yes, at one point or the other.
at one point or the other. Okay. And she worked, grew up there, and went to school in Turkestan.
That is correct.
Okay. And do you know what school she attended in Turkestan?
There was an elementary school in Pakistan, which was acquired by the company that acquired the property, and they moved the school to the Devil's Hole area, which was called Talbot School, which was an elementary kindergarten type school, which prepared children to the standard of pre-high school.
Okay. And you indicated for us that that school building is still standing. Where exactly could you, can you tell us exactly where that building is?
Yes. If you can locate the Methodist Church in Devil's Hill, Morrison Methodist Church, behind that church is the building that represented what they call Talbot School. And the Talbot name was a representation of Benjamin Darrell Talbot.
And in your recollection, do you understand that, or do you know why the building and the school were named after B.D. Talbot?
B.D. Talbot was a prominent citizen of Pakistan, and he had made a worthy contribution to the well-being of the residents in Pakistan, including his relatives, and they thought it fitting to call it Talbot's School. They were looking for a name, so Talbot was the likely name they have chosen.
Okay. And you mentioned, we had just previously discussed about Lydia and Julia being too ill to farm their land. So roughly, what age were they when the Act's appropriation happened?
Well, it happened in 1923. That's when they moved.
Yes.
So they had to be in their 70s easily.
Okay. And you mentioned to us that B.D. Talbot kept his horses in a stable very close to where the school was. Is that correct?
No, it was closer to his residence and his shop, which is right around the corner in
Okay.
Turkestan,
Okay.
but within hail of his residence.
Okay. And right at this time, there is an actual present-day workshop there where the stables were kept?
That is correct.
Okay. And they also repair golf carts in the area where B.D.
That
Talbot's
is
lane
correct.
would have been? And Dina Smith would have been a niece of B.D. Talbot as well?
That is right.
Okay. And she also owned property in Turkestan, is that correct?
That is correct. Her family owned property in Turkestan where her residence was located.
And in fact, there was a time where the government had to come and take her officially off of her property, is that correct?
Well, after being bored and disturbed by the intruders in an attempt to get off her property, that they confiscated. I don't blame her for being in opposition
Okay.
for moving. She did not have to move from where she was. She was very comfortable cooking her pot of soup and whatever else she cared to prepare for her family.
Okay.
And they picked the wrong time to disturb her. You don't disturb a woman when she's cooking in her kitchen. That is her territory.
And you also wrote that you understood that Seward Toddings, Goodwin Gosling, and another gentleman who you're not sure of the name of, came and actually spoke to her about moving and why she wouldn't move all during the same time when you mentioned about the hot pot and her cooking the soup.
Mm-hmm. And the gentleman went to his grave with the scars.
Because she actually poured
It
that
was
hot soup on them.
hot green pea soup. Can you imagine a boiling hot pot of green pea soup?
And so shortly after that is when the police then would have come to remove her from the property. Is that correct as well?
That is correct. The lawyers who were acting on behalf of the people who were interested in the acquisition they called the law.
And do you recall at that point in time who the lawyers may have been?
Yes. Mr. Calabras was one of the policemen at the time.
Okay. And how about the lawyer? Do you recall who the lawyers may have been at that time?
Goodwin Gosling
Okay.
and Seward Toddings.
Okay. And in terms of going back to Donna Smith, you understand that she was removed from her premises and put into another home?
That is correct.
Okay. And that, in fact, not all of her belongings were, in fact, brought to that new house for her?
No, they moved everything that was hers to the property that they had selected for her that she didn't want, and she refused to allow her things to be put in the property because it would have indicated some form of possession on her part by occupying it.
Yes.
So therefore, she sat outside in the weather, rain, blow, or shine. She was determined, like most women, determined to stand her ground. And her law was on her side. She stayed outside. She took her place outside and took the weather and died in trying.
Are you aware of possibly how long that period of time was between when she was removed until when she passed away?
Any time is too long, but it was a sufficient length of time for her goods to have rotted and become useless to anyone.
Okay, Ms. Richardson, could you give us 1 minute? We just want to take a short pause.
Thank you, Mr. Swan. There is a car number 42363. I gather it's red and orange. That is parking along the strip outside, and the bus is unable to turn. So if there's anyone here with car number 42363, would you kindly slip out and remove it? Again, car number 42363. You're impeding the bus from parking. Thank you, Mr. Swan.
Grateful Justice.
I'm just apologizing for interrupting your evidence.
I beg your pardon.
No. I am asking you for pardon. No, I'm just apologizing because I had to stop you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Apology accepted.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Tolbert, you then went on to talk to us about your 3 great uncles who went off to serve in the World War. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that for us?
Repeat again.
Sorry,
ma'am.
Ms. Richardson, yes. You had 3 great uncles who then went off and served at the First World War.
That is right.
Yes. You indicated that one had come back and lost his leg,
That's right.
and then they had to replace it with a cork.
Yes, prosthesis.
Prosthesis, yes, cork prosthesis. And he had to, when he was sent back to Bermuda, he was not able to return back to the home he knew, which was at Talkerstown.
Absolutely correct.
Okay.
After serving in the war for Britain as a territory, Bermuda as a territory, sent Bermudians to the war, volunteered to protect the British rights in Europe. And this was what they got in return.
And to your understanding, your other 2 uncles, great uncles, had come back as well, and they obviously suffered the same fate?
They suffered the same fate, but they didn't have the prosthesis that my uncle had.
But they did come back and obviously couldn't return to Talkerstown.
They couldn't return.
Okay. And then you further indicated to us that you are familiar with the Marsden graveyard in Talkerstown?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And you understood for us that that graveyard is in fact behind the Marsden Church in Pakistan?
That's right.
Okay. And it still remains there today, and it's small areas, is a small area surrounded by a stone wall?
Yes,
Okay. And that stone wall serves as a token marking of what appears to be an official graveyard, is that correct?
it appears,
Okay.
only appears. We cannot say exactly because there is evidence that that wall continues to the rear of the Methodist Church, and the graves that were in that path have been removed previously to form the golf course.
Okay.
So what we are interested in doing is having it resurveyed to establish the exact position of a wall that is not there, but it can be traced.
So when you indicated to us that you believe that the graveyard is much bigger than what the current limitations of the wall is, what or how did you become aware of that particular circumstance?
Well, someone went out and did a sounding which was sufficient to expose the burial of bodies in the area that was covered in just soil. So you couldn't walk up to it and see like they were able to do the other graves that were behind the wall, enclosed in the wall. So it's our belief that a careful research and study of any previous records could expose the design of the graveyard and location of the graves.
And you are aware of the survey that was done, which is referred to as the Savage Map. Are you aware of that Savage Map?
The Savage, that's the survey that I'm referring to in terms of exactly where the graves should be.
Okay. And are you aware, or were you ever in possession of any documentation, because I know you indicated a moment ago that you are aware that some of the graves may have already been removed outside of the walls. How did you become aware of that information?
Well, just looking at the Savage Map, which shows the outline of the church property with the wall that goes from the existing graveyard that we know to the back of the church, the old church. There is sufficient evidence that can be uncovered in terms of locating exactly where the graves are. Then Castle Harbor was laying out their graves, their golf course. They had to have had the records of everything pertaining to that property, old, new, and future. So with that assumption, it would be clear that we can locate exactly where the graves are or were. in comparison with the Savage map that shows the wall that would have otherwise denoted where the graves were in relation to the church. Because at Marsden Church in Smith's Parish, they have the similar type of arrangements where the graves are in the back of the church. So it was safe to assume that whoever designed the future or present use of the graves of the land would have shown what was located in the various portions of land.
You indicated for us that you are of the belief that when when Castle Harbor would have been designing their golf course, they would have been aware of the lay of the land in terms of the graveyard and the remainder of the premises.
That should be correct, because architects and golf course designers show from previous records what land would be used for the graveyard.
Okay.
So we've tried in going to London to talk to the previous developers of Castle Harbor, and they refused to disclose any information to us. They want to know under what authority we were inquiring about this property. It was a no-no.
And when was that you did that? When did you go to London to inquire about that particular issue?
Can you repeat that again?
Sure. You indicate that you traveled to London
Yes.
to obtain the records in terms of what the architects would have been aware of in terms of the property that the Castle Harbor Hotel would have owned. Can you let us know when you last attended London to do that?
Well, a group of members of our group, the Turkestan Historic Society, had been several places inquiring information, and London was one of them. And when they got there, they wanted to know under what authority did we have in making such inquiries. They smelt a rat. They were in trouble.
Got it. Mr. Richardson, are you aware of when or if Castle Harbor became in possession of the Turkestan Cemetery, or how did they acquire it?
So the Bermuda Development Company came in possession of this property in 1923, and Castle Harbor, under the group of people like One Trip, who was Pan American's developer, the airlines, they were party to this whole conspiracy. And therefore, we take it from the relationship they had with the Bermuda group, who were in partners with them in acquisition and development of that property, because One Trip was resident on the property for years, as I know. the interesting thing about my experience in Pakistan, I had the good fortune of being sent out to Pakistan without the parties who sent me there. The Land Valuation Office, when they introduced land tax to the Bermuda, they recruited me as one of these surveyors. And they, for some reason, unknown to myself and them, they allocated Pakistan to me to survey all the property. And since I knew about it, I was excited about the opportunity because I firsthand had the experience of measuring every property in Pakistan. So I know where they are, and I know who they earned it in 1966 when I went down there. And it's been dear to my heart in terms of getting to the bottom of these things over 40 odd years ago. It's haunting me.
You then went on to let us know that you have family members or ancestors who have been buried in the Marsden Church. Could you identify which ancestors you're speaking of?
In the Marsden Church in Pakistan, or?
Yes, the graveyard in Pakistan, yes.
Yes. My great-grandmother's husband was buried in Pakistan.
Any others that you're aware of, or that's the only one you're aware of?
Well, as I can remember close up, that's about as close as I've been able to get. Other people, as I said, there are other people in the Pakistan Historic Society that we need to include in the discussion because they have done research as well and would have on their records information that would be pertinent to your inquiry.
So we understand that you are a member of the Pakistan Historical Society. What exactly is your position within that organization at the moment?
I was the deputy chairman of the group of the Pakistan Historic Society.
And as part of that organization, you have taken on community events and leading the charge, I would say, against or bringing awareness to the Pakistan Cemetery. That's correct?
That is correct.
Yes. And one such thing that you brought attention to, or at least you questioned, was the statements made by lawyer Peter Smith in terms of the graveyard?
That is correct. His father was one of the members of the legal team that went out to negotiate and put together the package for the acquisition of the land. And he was the one who went to the newspaper and said that we were fairly treated because his father was one of the lawyers involved, hogwash.
And in your view, what was your opinion, or what was your view in terms of that whole sentiment?
It was specious.
And this conversation or the discussion around what Mr. Smith had said, this all happened sometime after 1998, that's correct?
That is correct. For some reason or other, he was addressing the Rotary, and he wanted to clear his father's name from the accusation of the act that they had performed for the acquisition of the land, the methods.
And is it correct that after this point that was put forward by Peter Smith, the Tuckerstown Historical Society, in fact, was formed?
That is correct.
Okay.
As a result of seeing that article in the paper, we were driven to organize ourselves as a community and as an action group to refute any statements that came thereafter pertaining the acquisition of land in Tuckerstown, that we would be a part of any discussion that would come about.
Okay. And around that time, were there any conversations being held with Castle Harbor, the Marsden Church, or any related organizations in terms of Tuckerstown and the graveyard at that particular point in time, in 1998, give or take?
You're asking the wrong person.
Okay.
You see, as a result of what happened after that, it caused me to leave the Marsden Methodist Church, where I was a vigorous participant in the community action of the church, and my purpose was defeated based on what the outcome was. I recommend that the commission search the Royal Gazette for articles that came about, that have come about in the last 10 years, 20 years, pertaining to Tuckerstown, because if you knew what was in those articles, a lot of questions you would not have to ask me because you already know.
Okay.
By researching that information, it's pertinent and very important in terms of completing the inquiry that we're onto at this moment.
And Mr. Richardson, do you have in your possession any such articles that you may want for us to take into consideration?
Well, CURB, I was a member of CURB for a long time. We have exchanged emails continuously for the last at least 15 years.
Okay.
And a lot of it pertains to the article called The Big Conversation. And if you had the records of what happened in the Big Conversation, you would have a lot of answers to pertinent questions. And some of them I would have already answered in that record. They have a videotape of the big conversation.
And as a result of the big conversation, is it correct that the Pakistan Historical Society led two bus loads of persons
That is
down to
right.
Pakistan to
That is right.
see the properties?
That is right.
Okay. And it's correct that you went and you was able to point out the property that belonged to your great great uncle B.D. Tolbert?
That is correct.
Okay. And showing that the house was still standing at that point, is that correct?
Pardon?
And you were still showing at that point that the house was standing and was able to point it out for persons?
That is correct.
Okay. And it's correct that also B.D. Tolbert was commonly known or friendly known as Uncle Ben, is that correct?
Uncle Ben. Not Rice, just Uncle Ben.
And we are correct in our understanding that currently that property and the home is owned by Dr. Ian Campbell?
That is correct. And we've been invited to see the property previously, previous to this date. And it was interesting how they were able to take a house like that that was built so long ago and convert it directly into what they have been able to do now, including the grand piano that is in the living room.
And then we understand that the Pakistan Historical Society has done even research in relation to the Francis Whitney Company. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And their role in terms of helping to acquire the property in Pakistan for the benefit of the tourism. Is that correct?
For the rich white Americans. That's what they said in an article in the 1922 edition of the National Geographic magazine.
Could you say the name of the magazine for us one more time again, Mr. Tolbert? Sorry, Mr. Richardson.
The article?
Yeah, the name of the magazine. We couldn't catch the name.
The article speaks to the acquisition of the land for rich white Americans. I'm quoting what was written in the article.
Okay.
And it was very timely because the prohibition had been in place at the time, and a place to drink had to be offshore. And ideally, the acquisition of land in Bermuda, which was only an hour and a half away by Pan American Airways, you could come down to Bermuda, and the Castle Harbor Hotel was available for the residents and the interested parties to live in their houses or at the hotel. And some of the hotel residents would stay up to a month at a time. You talk about tourism. My older brother, worked at Castle Harbor as a waiter, and he made a ton of money in tips because he gave first-class service. People got their money's worth. And their giving was beyond generosity as a result of the service they received. So they went on. Tourism took off, and lots of Bermudians were waiters and waitresses at Castle Harbor for years. Brought up their families, bought their homes, and everything. Everybody in the tourist business those days were able to make enough money of gratuities to be able to save and build houses and educated their families from the proceeds. We don't do it today because the system in Bermuda has so changed that instead of working for education, they give it to you, but gifts like that are not worth it because you don't know what is entailed in putting the money together for high school, as I did, and for college, as I did, and beyond that I've done. So the position that we put ourselves into, that we're prepared to give more than we get. Hence the imbalance in the return of your investment in children. Teach them to give something in return.
Thank you. So at this particular point, what I would like to turn your attention to is the cemetery and how you felt. Sorry, I should ask first. Were you present when Mr. Dubois and Mr. Stoffel went down to the cemetery and saw how it was left in ruins? Were you present at that time?
We were in the same picture, the same day. If you look at the picture, you might recognize me. I'm the guy with this head, this face.
Okay. So when you attended, how were you feeling about what you had seen?
Appalled. I was sick to my stomach. It's that act was enough to make a buzzard sick. And you cannot stir a buzzard's appetite. The more rotten it is, the better it feels.
Interesting. And you had indicated to us what you thought would be a particularly sensible remedy, or at least allow the members of the Tuckerstown Historical Society to feel as though we are making inroads in rectifying what happened so many years ago. Can you just elaborate for us what it is that you think would be the best particular remedy in this matter?
There is so much rubbish that has been coming about as a result of our meager attempt to get to the bottom of what happened to Tuckerstown. You see, it's been almost 100 years. In 3 years' time, it'll be 100 years that we were expelled from Tuckerstown. Here it is. I'll be 80 week after next. it's taken me more than a lifetime inquiring about this. And this is where we are today. It's going to be another 100 years if we keep up this pace. Or if we're just playing a game with the people like the mayor of New York, Bloomberg, who owns property in Turkestan on our property. And he can fly in and out of Bermuda on his private jet, pandemic or no pandemic. I'm not looking for that privilege for myself. I want a simple life. But for people who to have taken advantage of my humble people who were farmers. We were farmers. We were feeding the nation. Simply feeding the nation. Yet we were forced to give up what we were doing, feeding the nation, to someone else's frivolity. Fun and games. It's worse than a joke, because the punishment, the suffering of those that have been deprived of our belongings. We were building something of a future. My grandfather on my father's side came here as a shoemaker from Barbados to help us to build the foundation for the future for people like me. And yet the base was eroded, pulled out from under us in an unsettling way. If you try to change your child's school, as an example, take him to another school, you could disturb his whole future based on that transition. Some is necessary, and most of it is not necessary. So we would have done what we could with what we had, and we were doing it because Benjamin Talbot was an example of someone who would do what they could with what they had. And he was considered a rich man with a poor man's pocket. He was rich with ideas. He was rich with determination. He was rich with spirit and desire. He had it made. His sisters, my great-great-grandmother, yes, and my great-great-aunt were on their way. It's not their fault that they bought property that people later on liked. Nobody wanted it, but they took it. they secured that property for themselves and made it worth what it became. But the people who negotiated this deal were able to hoodwink us into thinking that we were going to a better place. Rubbish. I cringe when I think of what had happened to me from a long time ago. I don't want their houses, but I would take our land. You can flatten all the houses that built on our land, and we'll take it back and we'll plow it up and we'll farm it again, because we need farms. We need to feed the people. That's what they brought us here to do, to feed them and everybody else. But now that has changed because they have found another way to feed other things, drunken urges and other useless exercises. I don't play golf because I don't want to chase a ball around for half a day and have nothing to eat at the end of that, except at the 19th tee when I can have rum to drink with ginger beer to chase it. We're all caught up on this rubbish. We were good as farmers. I didn't become a farmer because the system said, oh, if you get an education, you can do better. Rubbish. Who are the farmers in Bermuda? They're not broke, not by any means. So why not be a farmer? At least you can eat healthy food from your own garden. We got this all cockeyed and wrong, and we're bringing our children along to believe that the way we're going is the way to go. Most of us in this room, our foreparents have struggled to get your education. What have you been able to do that makes sense for your children to be better citizens, better consumers, building a foundation of help each other to help each other?
Okay, Mr. Richardson. So we had one more thing that we wanted to go through with you, and just wanted you to have a look at the document I gave you this morning, which is Bermuda Sun article. Are you able to tell us, or can you tell us, who Ms. Wainwright is to you? Votes yes. Sorry, can you confirm that the article is dated Friday, the 14th of October, 2011?
You have your handkerchief, your Kleenex or something? This article makes me cry.
Okay.
This is my aunt,
Yes.
who was born in Pakistan.
Oh, Mr. Richardson, if you could speak into my just so we can hear you clearly.
And it hurts my heart to, I helped to write this article. And I sat with her for hours, trying to help her to give her version of a young lady, a young girl in Pakistan. She is my father's sister. She was my father's sister, and she did this article. And she talked about her childhood, and it did my heart good to hear her talk about her childhood, because adults today don't talk about their childhood to their children. So how can they appreciate the struggle that they reveal the likes of this?
Justice, if we could please have this as Exhibit 2, MDR2, Bermuda Sun article. I Wish I Still Lived in Turkestan by Helen Wainwright.
Kindly repeat the name of the article for me, Mr. Swan.
Yes, Justice, it's I Wish I Still Lived in Turkestan.
Okay.
This is a story on Helen Wainwright.
And it is MDR2,
Yes, please, Justice.
entered as exhibit MDR2.
Justice, do you have a copy of the actual exhibit?
Nothing,
No. Okay. So we'll make sure a copy is provided for the commissioners.
please. It's here? I have a statement, but I don't have
The
the annexation. You see it? It's on the screen, but thank you, Mr. Richardson.
Okay. Just at this point, those are all questions for Mr. Richardson. Reverend Bailey may have some questions for him. I know Reverend Bailey was present. No, okay. Reverend Bailey has no questions. So
Mr.
Justice.
Whalen has no questions.
No. So we can
Let
leave
me
it to
find out
commissioners.
from commissioners if they have any questions. Commissioners, yes? You have one? You have, you start? Mr. Richardson, commissioners will be asking you some questions. And if you just listen very carefully, you don't have to look at them. Just hear what they have to say and answer, please. We'll start with Ms. Fort, Commissioner Fort.
Mr. Richardson, thank you. Good morning. Your aunts, Lydia and Julia, were farmers. Do you have any indication what the loss of income would have been to them when they were displaced?
No, because looking at the cost of living then and now, and the fact that
Okay.
they earned the land that they farmed, they were able to amply live on the proceeds that they were getting from the land that they farmed. Having 35 acres is a lot of land. And for women, as they were very capable of hooking up the horse to the plow and plowing the ground even. So they were no less women doing that, but very helpful to their families and their partners. That was an example of a very close connection to the effort of raising the family.
And were your relatives allowed, because you indicated that your uncles or your relatives had several horses,
Yes.
and were they allowed to take those horses with them when they were displaced?
Well, no. They could have strenuously relocated them, but the property that they got later on wasn't quite as accessible as the expanse of land in Turkestan at the time. So it's all relative. The move was a major shift from what it was to what it became.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Forth. Commissioner Parent-Chief?
Good morning, Danny.
Good morning, my friend.
I must declare an interest. Mr. Richardson and myself were schoolmates at Berkeley Institute, and we worked together for many years. Mr. Richardson, would you put your mind to the big conversation? And again, I declare my interest because at the time that the big conversation was held, I was a member of the government. And I may, with you, be in those photographs when the buses were taken down to the Marsden graveyard. But more significantly, pertaining to the graveyard, you indicated in your statement that that graveyard may very well be more extensive than is indicated by the wall that is now in place and more recent photographs of that location. And you also indicated that the Savage map would give a clearer indication of the expanse or the boundaries of that graveyard. Would you agree with that? In terms of the present site, what would you say in terms of relative size that that graveyard would be, and where would it have extended? In other words, you have had a picture of it, and it shows the wall, the grave site, and then overlooking that, a high embankment and the clubhouse that is there presently. Could you indicate to us verbally where you would have thought and what extent that graveyard would have been?
Okay, if you stood by the now old graveyard and you look south, you'll see the church. You take a line from that graveyard to the church. Along that line would be the old burial ground that they have not recently demolished, but demolished in terms of trying to develop the land for other use and doing away with what would be a memorial of the dead, or for the dead, and just do away with it. It's useless because it's dead people, but they're still alive in spirit and in the hearts and minds of those of us that have been left behind.
Yeah, I want to bring your mind back to the location of the church. You mentioned the church as if it is still in existence. Does that building still stand?
Yes, that building still stands and is occupied by the Mid-Ocean Club or the Castle Harbor staff. It's that schoolroom and the church in that same area have become residences owned by the establishments, Castle Harbor and the Mid-Ocean Club.
So are you indicating that this graveyard would have extended over an area of acreage?
Yes.
Rather than the tight location that we see, which appears to be in the area of maybe a matter of 100 meters by 100 meters.
That's right.
So you're talking about a very large area.
Exactly. You see, if the memorial of the dead is the memorial of the dead, and they still live in our hearts somewhere as relatives, then let us care for the emotional aspect that this living soul had on us and have left with us, lest we forget.
Yeah, Ms. Richardson, also, I wish to bring your mind back to a survey that was carried out. You mentioned a survey by archaeologists. Would you, yes, it seems to be a bit emotional, but you do remember?
You got a joke?
No, sir, I'm dead serious. But I want to ask you, who supervised that archaeological exercise in trying to find out where the grave sites were? Can you name the individuals?
I want to be careful how I respond to that, because I am disturbed about what happened ultimately to that what was left of the graveyard. Without the research that I've been taught to do, to trace by examining the remains of the dead, to trace the historical background of the body that you come across. Scientifically, you can research anything today and come up with an answer. Well, this archaeologist as much science background that he might have had, he did not go to the extent of declaring that there were dead bodies and I could prove, or he could prove, that they were buried there. None of that was done. No one knows the contents of the graves that they demolished in Turkestan.
Yeah, Mr. Richardson, who succinctly was that archaeologist?
Oh, you really want to know?
Yes.
The head archaeologist in Bermuda has doctors as his first initial, and popularity as his last initial. And his second initial, to me, would be Dreamer. But getting past all of that,
What was he christened?
he was Christian. He was a Christian doctor. He was, his last name is, I don't want to be sickened by the thought. He works in dockyard at the Commission House, where the museum is.
And we ought to infer from that, as the person who was in charge of the National Museum,
Call his name and I whistle.
would it have been Dr. Harris?
Harris.
Oh, yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
I told you this. I can't even whistle.
Thank you, sir. So that's really what I was trying to elucidate, who the head archaeologist was, and who was he supervising, if you could remember, Mr. Richardson?
He has carte blanche, so no one supervises.
Who was he supervising? That was
No
my-
one supervises Dr. Harris. He has carte blanche to do whatever he feels like his emotion drives to do, and he has been able to convince people who pay him that he's doing the right thing. If you don't answer to anyone and you do what you like, you lose sight and foresight of where you're going and what you're doing. Hence, carelessness is a result of lack of supervision.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Parent Chief. Mr. Starling?
Hi, good morning, Mr. Richardson.
Good morning.
Thank you for your testimony so far. I have two questions. The first one, I'm just trying to establish what you're what your reference concerning the church and the cemetery. In looking at the 1901 Savage map, there are two structures immediately to the southwest of the current graveyard where the walls are, and the chapel is located some way away on the Savage map. My understanding is that initially those two structures right where the current cemetery are were the original church, which was a wooden church, and the stone church known as the chapel, which I believe is now dormitories, was constructed about 30 years later, and the cemetery was built at the time of that wooden church at the location of the current cemetery. Is that a correct assessment?
Well, to my knowledge, the church, the Methodist church in Tuckerstown, was the original church that we used. My parents went to church in Tuckerstown at that stone building that is now existing. And they went to school at the building next door, which was the school for Tuckerstown, elementary school, for that period of time. So if there were a wooden church, that was an old phenomenon. And if you, I don't know if the Savage map shows a wooden church in the place of the existing church.
The Savage map just shows two structures. It doesn't identify them, but there is other archaeological evidence that those were the 1830 wooden church prior to the stone chapel being built.
Yeah. But, well, the existing structures is about as far back as our research, and it's recent research, how it goes. The records and the history of Tuckerstown hasn't been written like the history of Devonshire.
Thank you. I'll move on to my second question now, if you will. In your statement, you talk about the statement made by lawyer Peter Smith in regards to his father. I'm not sure, but I believe his father was A.C. Smith, who was the commission secretary for the Bermuda Development Company, which led the expropriation. And in your statement, you say that Peter Smith said that his father, you get where I'm going, that his father said that the people of Tuckerstown were treated fairly, and then you note that you completely disagreed with this. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to explain more why you disagree with Peter Smith's statement that it was treated fairly.
The advent of Peter Smith's article that came from a statement that he made at the Rotary. I say that in sequence because the occasion and where he made the speech and who made it, to me, left a lot to be desired, because his father wasn't here to give evidence with respect to the level of his participation in negotiations of the acquisition of the property from the then residents of Tuckerstown. And for them to have had to form a tribunal to adjust the amount of money that my great-great-uncle had asked for and was refused, and was given a take it or leave it situation is gross. And for him to have made the statement, he wasn't there when his father and the others made the decision. Somebody told him, but I know that my uncle, my great-uncle, great-great-uncle, asked for 25,000 pounds for his property because it was worth it by today or yesterday's standards. That land that they got from my uncle, if it were in today's markets, it would encompass a lot of houses, big houses that are on 2 and 3 acres of land. And if the sum total of that property by today's standards would be extraordinary. So any argument that I hear or discussion that I hear about fairness is muted based on the experience of my relatives, not your or anybody else's. My relatives were directly affected. Hence, I've been affected by it. And the unfortunate part about it, that I have a better education than high school. So I have been able to reason logically or otherwise through the process of fairness and the exchange. So I know I make no bones about it.
So if I can just clarify, you argue it was unfair because you feel that the evaluators undervalued the property of Uncle B.D., of Mr. B.D. Taba. Is that correct?
Grossly.
Grossly. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Starling. Mrs. Milliken, right?
Good morning, Mr. Richardson. Good morning. You mentioned earlier in your comments that you recall that your brother did very well at the Castle Harbor Hotel, working in the tourism industry. And in fact, you referred to other families who also worked in the tourism industry. My question to you is whether the residents of Tuckerstown, like your family members, took a position on tourism as a rationale for taking your land, or whether you had other views of it. Could you respond to that?
Yes. That is an interesting question. And the Talbot brothers were some of the first people to go back to Tuckerstown to work in tourism. The records show that. It didn't matter to them who took over their father's property as long as they got the land where they are today. So they were in spitting distance of Tuckerstown, Castle Harbor, and Middleton Club, where they entertained this free-loading crowd that came from America to occupy this so-called land of the free. So they didn't do us a favor by having a job to offer these people. That wasn't a home that they took from them. They had to take the pittance that they received from the rich Americans and do the best they could for what they had offered. That's where the Towards live today. Napton Hill is where we live today as a result of what happened to our great-great-grandmother. Listen, I'm going to be satisfied with what we were able to get, because some people got nothing. And we've made every effort to use what great-great-granny was able to use her common sense and meager education and deep desire to do better by taking what she had and doing the best she could. She did quite well. But guess what? She'd have done a heck of a lot better if she had stayed where she was, because she had the land. And all her great-grandchildren, like myself, who were able to develop the land that she got. Imagine her 40 great-great-grandchildren having the urge and the desire to occupy the land she had. Imagine where we would have been today. We can't say like Peter Smith's father said, think yourself lucky. It's not about luck. It's about the opportunity that we had to forego for the sake of others. Yes, we have thought about others. We've become good citizens of a country that took the responsibility to devalue us as earners and sell us off at what they wanted to sell us off. You cannot do that today. Are we going to do the same thing with Riddles Bay? Sell the land in Riddles Bay to rich white Americans or people with money? In fact, people with money is not the phrase. Because when Oprah Winfrey wanted to buy a house in Tuckerstown, the legislation of that time turned that deal down. There are several thoughts around that. Oprah Winfrey, who was a star in her own right, a prominent, rich black American whose money was as good in anywhere, including America, but not good enough for Bermuda. But yet Bloomberg could come with his money and buy property in Turkestan, does that create some sort of frenzy in your mind? Maybe it doesn't. But from what my experience have been in Bermuda and around the world, I raised the question as to, does it make sense? We have to be careful how we do and what we do, because beware of the Ides of March. If you understand Shakespeare, as we were taught all of these things in elementary school and high school, be careful what you say, because what you say is from your mouth, and your mouth has teeth, and it'll come back and bite you where you don't be bitten.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Thank you very much indeed.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Milligan-White. I know it's lunchtime. Let me find out from council if you're going to be having any redress. Will you be having any redress?
No redress, Justice.
Okay. Very well. Let me call on Mr. Stovall then to ask his questions.
Good morning, Mr. Richardson.
Good morning, neighbor.
Twice over.
Don't show any preference.
Not at all. I don't like you. I just have a few questions. How many people are encompassed within the Turkestan Historical Society?
A lot of us have passed away.
So, I mean, just a gauge.
There
is it
are
20
no
people?
there are no newcomers or interested parties, sadly enough, because we thought that we were setting the stage for a common generation to pick up on an important aspect of history about Bermuda and Bermuda's people and what could happen to us, because he who hesitates is lost. And we were trying to bridge the gap between those who wanted to be and who were. The gap has widened. The changes have expanded. The interest has been watered down. We're not hungry anymore. In fact, let me get to your answer. We don't have a membership anymore. It's unfortunate. We were registered as a charity, which we had to renew every year. And because the people who were in the positions initially, we've all taken sick or died at one point or the other. I am here but for the grace of God. I had a triple stroke, and any of you who know what a triple stroke is, it begins with D and ends with H. Death. I was dead, according to the doctors. I was crippled. I couldn't talk. I couldn't walk. But I kept up the faith in my heart of hearts. I persevered, trying to hold on to something that I thought was important for Bermudians, especially my relatives, to take a grip off. We might not get the money back, the land back, but let the world be known what happened to us, and don't let us die, that it die with all of us who are dying. We've lived through a lot of stuff. I'm not old enough to have, I was born in 1940, not 1923. But my father, who was born in Pakistan, who left under duress when he was 9 years old with his granny and his aunts, was able to pass it on to me and inspire me to hold on to it. But to get younger people interested, what do we have to do? What got me interested? Pass it on. Bishop Chauncey Smith was my father's first cousin, 2 sisters' children. He had a comprehensive knowledge of Pakistan because he was born there. He left when he was 2 years old. He can remember his grandmother hooking up the trolley and taking goods from Pakistan. We didn't have the trucks then, from Pakistan to Napton Hill. It's a good thing they didn't go to Somerset. They'd still be on the road. But Napton Hill was close enough, and that's where we are today. We're thankful. Some of my cousins have lost the property that their granny gave them. My father kept his and bought some of the property back his granny had sold to outsiders. He had the ambition. He left school when he was 9 years old. But when he moved from Pakistan, he was old enough for his granny to send him to work to learn a trade. And he became a shoemaker and a master mason. He had the desire to expand and the skill to grow. And if we don't do this with our children, regardless of how much education you get on top of what you get, you can still wound up being poor in spirit, poor in accomplishment. I've seen some highly academically capable children throw gifts from their parents almost literally in the trash by the way they behave and respect the opportunity they've been given. We have to develop determination, the spirit of togetherness, forward-looking, forward-thriving, forward holding on the precious gifts of God through your parents.
Thank you. I just have a couple more questions. Have you experienced any resistance from the survivors, descendants of Tockerstown settlement, of the Tockerstown settlement, in your efforts to ascertain what actually happened with the expulsion of the residents?
Some people say I'm satisfied with what we got, but they didn't have anything before. If you had 35 acres and someone gave you 2, and you're satisfied with the 2 that they gave you, because that's all you had before, then you'll be satisfied. But if you had 140 acres in your family, and they gave only enough to buy 2, that is fair with UN in front of it. Unfair. What is fair? I'll leave that to you learned people to decide. The simple word FAIR. FARE is a means of passage. I don't want that. I have 2 legs. I can walk. But FAIR can carry me further than my legs can jump me. Because I need this, and I can't jump with it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richardson.
You're quite welcome.
That concludes my questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very much.
Mr. Stabile. Mrs. Spence?
Good day, Mr. Richardson. My question, or my questions have to do with the Tockerstown gravesite. What concerns me is how far down do you think that excavation actually went in the graveyard itself, or the burial plots themselves? How far down do they excavate?
It's hard to tell. It is very, very difficult to tell how far, because when we were notified that the graves had been demolished, it was too late to see how far down, because they took the stones that that formed the grave, and they threw them in the graves, and they filled them up. So when we got there, it was full of debris from the demolition. And it's too bad that we didn't get there before that time. I think they purposely did that so that we wouldn't see what was inside. Let me just give you a story about graves. At St. Mark's Church, they had graves that were filled with sand on top of the corpse. That's how they used to bury people years ago. My father, being a Mason, the gentleman by the name of Trevor Munner's father, the politician, ex-politician's father, he had a grave in St. Mark's Church that had soil thrown upon the dead person. That summer, I worked with my father, and we had a job cleaning out this grave. So he says to me, go get in the grave, dig up the soil, and clear it out. Take it deep enough for us to get another coffin or two in it. I, being young, full of brevity, full of nerve and determination, I proceeded to dig the soil out of the grave. When I was below my shoulders, the coffin that was in there caved in, and I felt it move. And without touching the sides, I was out of the grave with the shovel in my hand, full of soil. And I wondered how I got there. And my father was standing there laughing his head off. I didn't turn white.
The reason I ask is
But-
that, okay, are you finished your story? I'm sorry. The reason I'm asking is that I was wondering whether you knew the protocol or the requirements for interring or disinterment of human remains.
Well, the graves have always been 6 foot deep, from my experience. That's why I was trying to give you the background for what I knew about a grave and how deep it was, because I had to get out of it.
Yeah.
So if that grave had been deep as that one, it took a lot of filling to fill it up to the top where they have it now.
I was asking that line of question because I wanted to know what would constitute the desecration of a grave. Is the removal of the outer or destruction of the outer casings of the grave, would that be considered a desecration, or if it had to go, or, a certain depth down in order to constitute a desecration?
Yes. In my knowledge, the unsupervised and disposal of dead bodies that have been buried is a crime.
So it appears under the Public Health Act, because you have to get permissions to actually, for the disinterment of human remains. And I was just wondering, do you know whether or not that power was granted, and to whom it was granted?
It was an indiscriminate part of the archivist who was in charge of having these. In my opinion, it was desecration and destructive in terms of what their intentions were or what they actually did. The act of desecration in thought or deed is illegal. You can't just go around digging up dead bodies and throwing the bodies in the trash or wherever you put them. There's something sacrilegious about the dead body, and we have to respect the dead because they're not there to defend themselves, so they depend on us who are responsible for the disposal of the dead body to do it correctly. And if they took dead bodies out of those graves, they should have told us where they put them. They haven't told us a thing. So what recourse is there for those of us who have suffered from this desecration?
Okay, given that line of questioning, would your committee, the church, and Tuckerstown, anyone that was involved in the process, going forward, would you be willing to work with those who may have created a breach to carry out the necessary work so that it begins to repair the not just the physical damage but the psychological damage? Would you be willing to, your committee, willing to work to make amends for what has happened to the Tuckerstown gravesite?
That is a tall order because if they knew the law or they were aware of the inconvenience or discomfort that the people who have people buried there, their rights were disturbed, it's too late to get us to have an amicable agreement with someone who needs to right a wrong. I didn't do the wrong. They have a conscience and aware of the law of handling the dead. My lesson to them is too late. They've done what they wanted to do. All I would request to them is they give an answer to what they did with the dead bodies that they found. Where are they? Give them a proper resting place, and they have a system for that. Pembroke, I was on the Pembroke Council for years, and we were in charge of the graveyard. And every family who had people there in the Pembroke grave would be notified, your grave has too many dead bodies in there. Can we have permission to remove the dead bodies? And it was ceremoniously done, a preacher and everything. And the bones would be removed, properly packaged, and gracefully placed in a common burial ground where you could stack bones instead of coffins. They could have done that in Turkestan with the graveyard if there were bones in there. They didn't do it. So it's too late to right the wrong. If the archivist is so talented and so capable and well trained, he forgot the common sense theory of what you do with dead bodies. You respectfully recover them and respectfully dispose of them. That wasn't done.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richardson, for your time and sharing your experience with us. We certainly appreciate it as commissioners. Thank you. Council, that is the end of your witnesses for the day, I think?
That is correct, yes, Justice.
Yes. So with that said, we're adjourning for today, and we'll resume at 10 a.m. in the morning. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Grateful.
Thank you.